Bonjour à toutes et à tous, bienvenue à la médiathèque de la Maison méditerranéenne des sciences de l'homme à Aix-en-Provence pour cette nouvelle séance de Livres MAM. Livres MAM est un cycle d'entretien organisé par l'IREMAM, l'Institut de recherche et d'études sur les mondes arabes et musulmans, un laboratoire affilié au CNRS et à Aix-Marseille Université. Je suis Marie Vannetzel, chargée de recherche à l'IREMAM. Cette séance se déroulera en anglais car nous avons le plaisir d'inviter aujourd'hui Carl Rommel qui va donc nous parler de son ouvrage. Good morning, Carl Rommel. We are very happy to have you here at IREMAM to talk about this important and thrilling book, Egypt's Football Revolution, Emotion, Masculinity and Uneasy Politics, that was published in 2021 by Texas University Press. Welcome.
Thank you, Marie. I'm very happy to be here next.
So let me introduce you briefly to start the discussion. You are a social anthropologist at Uppsala University in Sweden, a place where you have the football club of your heart, IK Sirius, since you were a child, and a place where you also completed in another life studies in engineering before turning to social sciences. Then you did a master and eventually also a PhD at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London in 2015. You then shared in several projects as a postdoctoral fellow in Berlin, Bern, and Helsinki, and you also joined CEDEJ in Cairo as an associate researcher. So this gorgeous monograph is based on your doctoral study that is, of course, much intricated to your own trajectory in Egypt. You actually lived in Cairo back in the mid-2000s, and this is when you encountered Egyptian football and experienced firsthand what you call the football bubble that characterized the late Mubarak era. The book is organized around three axes: the inflation of this bubble, then its critical climax, that was also the beginning of its burst, and finally, its dramatic deflation. In all of these three parts of the book, you show how football impacted on and was impacted by intense political developments that unfolded in revolutionary and counter-revolutionary Egypt, most importantly between the mid-2000s and 2019. In this way, the book makes a decisive contribution by providing another story, that is another timeline and untold stories of this critical period. So my first question would be, can you elaborate a bit on this football bubble and the alternative timeline that you have come to bring out?
I'm glad you pick up on this thing about an alternative timeline, because I think it's one of the things that anthropologists and social scientists can be very good at doing when it comes to studying revolutionary transition, that we can sort of show how the events that we might think are the main events might not be the main events for everyone. So I'm trying to do that in this book. So if we start with this thing that I call a bubble, it's basically my way of conceptualizing this huge hype that happened around football in Egypt in the late 2000s. And especially between 2006 and 2008, when Egypt are winning 3 consecutive Africa Cup of Nations, 2006, 8 and 10. My point is that this football bubble that was sort of encapsulating the nation at this time, it was not only a result of these great results on the pitch, it was also a matter of a lot of money coming into the game from the state. They were owning these state-owned clubs, private satellite television was booming, and they were focusing enormously on football at the time. There was a lot of football in television, talk shows, matches and everything. And also in popular cultures, you had a lot of films that were like themed around football and really portraying football as this big thing, and also pop culture. So you had pop music. So you had like pop stars singing songs explicitly about the famous football team. So I think what I'm trying to do here is to say how all these things came together in this late Mubarak era, 2006 to 11, to make this sort of bubble of emotion, victory, and success, and how it also came to sort of define in Egypt what was supposed to be a normal Egyptian man at the time. So there was this idea that if you were a normal guy in Egypt in 2006 or the late 2000s, you were supposed to like football and be very passionate about the game. And at the same time, if you were not liking football, you didn't really care about football, you were considered an outsider, not really a proper Egyptian, right? And the thing is here, which is my main political argument here, is that this way of being a normal Egyptian guy suited the Mubarak regime, and especially Hosni Mubarak, but also his two sons, Ala and Gamal. And they sort of they embodied this football man. So it became a very important and useful way for the regime to sort of be one with a successful version of the people. So that was sort of the bubble thing. So what is happening then, and when we come back to this idea of timeline, is that my book sort of suggests that this bubble began to sort of burst and fall apart already in November 2009. So a little bit of a year before January 2011. And what is happening in November 2009 in Egypt is that Egypt is playing two extremely hyped and hyped football games against Algeria in the World Cup qualifying. So it's the qualification for the 2010 World Cup in South Africa. And they play one game in Cairo, and then they win this game by 2-0, and then they play another playoff in Sudan a few days later. And these are sort of it was enormous focus on these games. They were supposed to be the most important games ever played in Egypt because it was so important for the team to reach the World Cup. And it was like big fights in the streets between fans, both in Cairo and then in Khartoum. And it also developed into sort of a diplomatic crisis between the two countries as President Mubarak was sort of lashing out against Algeria. So my point is here that this was both the sort of the peak of this sort of nationalist football bubble, where everything was sort of coming to really peaking, but also the beginning of the end, insofar that when Egypt lost the second game of this tournament of these two games, they missed the World Cup. What is happening is that a lot of people are coming out starting to criticizing football and maybe saying that maybe we've been caring too much about this game, maybe we've been too obsessed with football. And this critique is it's in the press. I'm sort of following press archive through this period. And it's mainly raised by two different groups. So it's like people who are considered respectable. So it's like Islamists or intellectuals, basically, who are sort of saying that maybe we've been focusing too much on football and we should maybe do something else with our lives, basically. And my point is that I'm doing interviews with people as well, is that this was also affecting normal fans. So a lot of people are doing interviews saying that after 2009, after this loss to Algeria, we all felt that football was not the same anymore. Football lost something, right? So this is like, so if you come back to alternative timeline, maybe you can say that the end of Mubarak's football nation happened in November 2009 and not in January 2011. So it's like it's a different type of timeline. So this is one thing. So the other big argument that I'm making, which also refers to this idea of a transition over the revolutionary years, is that in the late Mubarak era, you have a new type of fans involved in Egypt. So you have these guys called the ultras. It's like a younger type of fans. They're more internationally oriented. They are more dedicated. They support the clubs rather than the national team. They want to support. They insist that football should be watched at the stadium, not on television, right? And they bring together a very different type of spectacle at the stadium. So they have flags, they have pyrotechnical flares, they have graffiti, they are dancing, they are chanting, they are singing. And I'm sort of describing this as an alternative subculture that is sort of challenging this football bubble, right? So you have, the football bubble is very mediatized, very politically, very top-down driven. And here you have a sort of bottom-up DIY sort of fan culture that is sort of challenging the football bubble. And this starts in 2007. It grows very quickly in 2009 and 10, where you have tens of thousands of kids at the stadium. And in 2011, when the revolution really strikes in Tahrir Square, for example, the ultras become very important in this transition, and mainly because they have the experience of fighting the police at the stadium, which they're bringing into Tahrir Square, and they are very much instrumental in this transition, right? But then in terms of key events again, the key event for the ultras is probably not January 2011, but 1st of February 2012. So what is happening on 1st of February 2012? It's a game between Al Ahly, which is the biggest Cairo club. They're going to play an away game in Port Said versus Al Masri. And they have away fans coming, and there's a huge massacre happening, basically. After the final whistle, the away fans from Ahly, the ultras from Ahly, are attacked in the stands by the home fans. And in the end, 72 ultras fans are killed. They are strangled, they are burned to death, they die in a stampede. It's a totally horrific event. So what is happening after this event is that it fundamentally shifts the position of the ultras, both in society and also in the revolutionary struggle. On the one hand, there are no more games. The games are stopped, so the thing that they've done at the stadium is sort of aborted, but they also come out in the streets instead for this campaign for retribution, for justice for the martyrs. They have their sort of emotional style, if you like, with flags and singing and everything, is in the streets and becoming a very central part of the revolution, especially in 2012 for roughly 1 year. And they've become quite famous and very sort of popular and liked by the general public at the time. They are seen as this sort of, I write at some point as the darlings of the revolution, I guess, you know, how they are sort of, they have this ability to both be respectable and like real men, and also getting things done and using violence, but only in a measured way, you know, so not using too much violence, but using violence sometimes to getting their things done. So that's sort of the ultras revolution, I guess, which I'm portraying in the large chunk of the book. And then just to finish this off, there's also the end point of the ultras revolution is also different maybe to the general normal timeline, right? So because we know, of course, that the revolutionary transition in Egypt very much comes to an end in the summer of 2013, right? You have a military coup on the 3rd of July, and then you have the Rabaa massacre a couple of months later. When it comes to ultras, though, they already sort of, their revolutionary push is already aborted a few months earlier, when it's a lot of details here, I'm not going to go into all the details, but they're sort of celebrating the death sentences against 21 of the fans from the other team who killed them in this massacre in 2012, right? So it's a little bit of a complex story, but they celebrate this in a very sort of spectacular manner in central Cairo, and a lot of quote-unquote neutrals who are like the ultras, but they're revolutionaries, but not necessarily into football. They start to be like hesitant to these guys. Like, why are they celebrating these death sentences? Shouldn't they go after the police and the military instead? So I guess what you have here is once again that you have like, okay, a different revolutionary timeline where the football revolution might have ended 6 months before the coup that actually brought everything to an end. Because today the ultras are crashed, they are either in prison, a lot of them have moved abroad. There are no real, there's no fans at the stadium. So the sort of, today it's totally dead.
So the bubble is not only a useful metaphor to write another historical account. It also spotlights the way you theoretically articulate emotions, materialities, and politics. And I think this is the second important contribution of your book. You actually achieve to talk about feelings without psychologizing the analysis. And I was very much interested into the distinction that you make, without reifying it, between emotions, that is, sensations that are mediated by language, and affects that are rather mediated by materialities. So can you explain how you use this notion to analyze the emotional or affective politics of football in Egypt before and after the revolution?
Yeah, sure. So then we have to go back to this bubble thing again, right? The sort of the big hype in the late Mubarak years. Because what I'm trying to do here is to try to understand what happens when so the whole nation, in a way, gets encapsulated by the strong emotions or affects that are generated by a huge spectator sport, in this case football, right, in Egypt in the late 2000s. And as you rightly point out, and I'm happy for that I don't really try to psychologize feelings. Like, I think I'm not that interested in what happens in the human body when we feel something, whether it's the nervous system or some Freudian unconscious. That's not really my thing. I think that's a job of psychologists rather than anthropologists. What I'm trying to look at rather is a sort of, let's call it the material, ideological, political, or mediatized scaffolding, the sort of the structures that make people have the ability to feel certain feelings in certain situations, if you put it that way, right? So sort of the surroundings rather than the individual body. And if you then go back to the Mubarak era, to this football bubble, you know, I conceptualize this as a sort of thing, you know, this big thing that comes together and create these emotions. As I said, it was media, it was money, it was pop culture, homegrown players, a generation of players that were really, really famous at the time, historical rivalries, you know, particular games versus Algeria, for example, as I just talked about. and also that they were winning so many games, of course. You know, the fact that they were just winning and winning and winning was just like accelerating this thing, you know. And I think this is important when it comes to football as an emotional spectacle. I think it's important to not forget that in the end of the day, you're dealing with these unpredictable games, right? Which you never really know if you're going to win or lose. And because you don't know if you're going to win or lose, you can invest so much and then you lose and there is no occasion. But when you win, you feel even more, right? So there's something with the unpredictability that sort of drives this emotionality around football. So more theoretically, I'm using anthropologist Anne Stoller's work. She's talking about something called affective states, which when she's talking about, you know, like affective states is sort of a formation of a distribution of sentiments, as she says, right? How different people feel different things for different phenomena, but also for different each other somehow. You know? So you have different feelings towards different people in the society. And she talks about this as a central modality of rule, of like power, actually state power in many cases. And in Mubarak's Egypt, I think this was clearly the case. You know, the feelings for football staked out, as I said, who is a normal Egyptian, who is an abnormal Egyptian, how to feel for the nation, what to feel and not to feel. And I think this became a very important part of the regime's soft power at this time. As far as the ultras is concerned, the sort of revolutionary fans, that was also an emotional political push, if you put it that way, right? So I spent quite a bit of time in the book looking at how these ultras kids, or they were usually in the late teens or early 20s, they worked very hard to sort of create this emotional atmosphere at the stadium. They made flags, composed songs, they made T-shirts, they painted graffiti, they brought in they choreographed these sort of big entrance scenes. So if you will, here you have sort of an oppositional distribution of sentiments. You have like the state distribution of sentiment, and then you have the ultras distribution of sentiments. They were sort of set up against each other. So two emotional constellations, two ways of being an emotional Egyptian man. And as far as you also said this thing about emotions and affect and the distinction between the two, you're correct to know that this is a dividing line in a lot of anthropological literature. And if you want to go through this a little bit quicker, it's like anthropology of emotions, which is a tradition that goes back to the 70s and 80s, have most often been interested in articulated or verbalized feelings. You know, so like they have been interested in what terms are used for different feelings. You know, I'm sad, I'm happy, and how the connotations of that, whether it's like connoted, and it could be different in different contexts, right? So it's like some places anger is masculine, some places anger is feminine, whatever. And they've been sort of the main point here is that feelings is nothing natural, but it's something that is sort of embedded in culture. What we feel is a matter of culture variability. Studies of affect, which is a newer trend, sort of the last 20 years, it's more focused on, say, pre-verbal sensations, things that are instant, that just happen in an atmosphere in a room or in a space or something like this. Things that we feel before knowing it and before putting words to it, right? So they are more interested in maybe infrastructure, space, materiality, vibrations. So for me, this distinction is both a useful heuristic, but also something that I'm trying to break away from a bit. I think in football it's clear that it's both, you know. So on the one hand, of course, football is something very affective. You go into a stadium and you just feel this, wow, you know, there's like all these people, there's a crowd, there's a game, there's a goal maybe. So it's very direct in this sort of affective sort of way. On the other hand, in order to really appreciate those feelings that you feel inside a stadium, you also need to have this sort of awareness of narratives, history, culture, symbolism and everything, right? So it's not purely non-verbal pre-culture, right? So it's a mix of the two. So I try to do this and try to really focus in on this dynamics in one chapter of the book, where I follow one of my closest interlocutors and what makes him emotionally invested in football. So how he prepared for matches, how he learned details and histories about clubs and players, how we went to hundreds of games and lost many games and then won a game, you know, these things that are happening and how these things are coming together. So I guess that's my theoretical approach, to like both to bridge the affect emotion divide a bit, and also looking at how this sort of is redistributing sentiments that in the end are becoming political. So you have like emotions also being a key aspect of political rule and also oppositional politics.
So, talking about politics, one thing that you discuss in several chapters of the book is the non-political norm that saturates and overdetermines politics in Egypt. This is a major phenomenon that actually Alain Roussillon addressed in a not so well-known article published in 1996 in Peuple Méditerranéen. So this is the name of a journal. And you actually found and managed to translate this article in your analysis. So could you develop what you call the double bind of siasa, meaning politics in Arabic, double bind of siasa, in the book, and how this helps to understand the tragic fate of the ultras, because their rise and fall is very much linked to this uneasy balance of politics.
So one theme, as you say, that appears in several chapters of the book is this sort of unease that I realized that so many people I met in Cairo felt vis-a-vis politics, or siasa in Arabic, right? So it even made it into the book's title. So the book's title is Egypt's Football Revolution, Emotional Masculinity and Uneasy Politics. It's like the final part of the second part of the title. So basically I'm trying to look at, say, emic, local understandings of politics, siasa, what it really means, and what that did for the sort of revolutionary transition, and more specifically for the ultras' rise and fall story that I just mentioned. So in my book, I also tried to maybe take a step back and see where this is coming from historically, and then also see what is happening with it in the present. And as you say, Alain Roussillon was writing very interestingly about this, particularly in the Nasser era, how this was a very key sort of, this fear of politics was important politically, as you put it that way. And I build on his work and also on a historian called Ben Ghia, who delineate to this sort of fear of the political is articulated with and inside Egyptian nationalism. Sort of, if you simplify the dynamic, it's actually quite simple. It's like, okay, so Egyptian nationalism in general, arguably, means that everyone should work for the interest of the whole people, of everyone, right? Politics, on the other hand, means working for a specific party, for the interest of a specific group. So there is a sort of fundamental tension here, right? So between politics and nationalism. So everyone who's deemed, if you're deemed political in Egypt, you are very easily cast as non-nationalist and not working for the whole people. And that's sort of a way to marginalize people from public debates. So this tension fuels what I call then the double bind of siasa, or also the politics of politics, and at another occasion of the book. And it's this sort of paradoxical thing, right, that you mentioned, is that being non-political is sort of key for being politically effective. Non-political in an emic way is key for being politically effective in an ethic way, as we sort of think of politics. And this double bind is very clear in my story about the ultras, right? So they were in many ways very revolutionary, very radical. They used violence in many types of ways. They were very sort of masculine and pushy and in the streets. Yet, as most actors in this period between 2011 and 2013, they also were very insistent. We are a nationalist force, and we're working for the common good of all the people. We're not working for. It was always this sort of tension, right? And this was key to their popularity. That was also one reason why they became so popular also among people who didn't care about them really and didn't know them and was from a totally different generation. They always insisted that we will never do anything, whatever they did, and in their revolutionary push, they would never hurt other Egyptian citizens, okay? In cases when they risk doing that, they rather refrain from action, So, but I also think that this eventually, or ultimately, put limitations on the way, the kind of revolution that they could do. Because in order to remain non-political, they could not join certain demonstrations, they could not ally with certain groups, they could not push for certain causes, they could not side between President Morsi and the opposition in spring 2013, for example. They became a little bit passive at times, right? And I think this is one reason why the revolutionary momentum was lost in the end. You know, they ended up in this double bind, as I call it, where they either had to become quite passive and not acting very much at all, or acting, but then looking political, right? So you had this, for a moment it worked out, but then for a moment it just didn't work out. And that's basically the double bind of CS. And I think I'm suggesting in the conclusion of the book that maybe this could be extrapolated a bit as well to maybe not only something that is relevant for the ultras, but maybe for the Egyptian revolution more generally. Because I would insist that almost any type of political or like group who would like to be part of the political game in Egypt between 2011 and 2013, arguably also today, whether Islamist, revolutionary youth, liberal, socialist, the army, the old regime, they all consider themselves nationalists. You know, first and foremost, this is a nationalist revolution. We're working for the interest of all people. And this also meant then that they could not really be considered political, right? So the question was never like, it was not really parties working for different interest groups. It was rather everyone wanted to say that we are the best representatives of the entire people, you know. So this was the game, you know, the political game, rather than saying that we fight for the working class, we fight for, you know. And I guess the ultimate question is what kind of revolutionary politics or revolutionary, call it politics, is possible if you have to be non-political all the time, right? How is this limiting your possibilities of action, I guess? And I think this is something worth thinking of. And I think they might add a small piece to the puzzle of why the revolution ultimately didn't really succeed.
Having myself studied another group, another segment of Egyptian society during the late Mubarak era and also the years of revolution, so the Muslim Brotherhood, I was actually struck by the analogy of the conclusion that we both reached. And the recurrent, one of the recurrent arguments that, for example, the people who used to vote for the Muslim Brotherhood in the past, during Mubarak era, then during the revolution, they started to disapprove the way the Muslim Brotherhood entered into politics, or get involved into politics. And so it was quite paradoxical, because when they used to vote for the Muslim Brothers in the parliament, this was politics, but it was not perceived as siyasi, exactly as you say. It was perceived as khadami, as a way of doing services, of doing goodness, and so on. So I guess they were also at some point stuck in this double bind of siyasa, although very differently, obviously, than the ultras. So I would like to push you, talking about the Muslim Brotherhood, I would like to push you a bit to rethink maybe of the relationships between Islamists and football. You argue that in the Mubarak era, Islamists, maybe such as the Muslim Brothers, were kind of out of the bubble, of the football bubble of normality, because they kind of disliked football. Yet at the local level, the Muslim Brotherhood practiced football very much. You know, it was the main activity to educate and to recruit new members. They also had at the national mediatic level a very important figure to identify with, who is Mohamed Abu Trika. He was the most famous player of the club Al Ahly. So is it possible that there was a kind of Islamist football emotional political style, not outside of the bubble, but maybe on the margins of this bubble?
Just to rehearse my argument, when I talk about the Islamists, it's related to this idea about the normal Egyptian man that was sort of created in this football bubble in the late Mubarak era. And as I said, this normal guy, which was very much in line with the regime and the media and everything, he was always very often contrasted to his others who were not really normal, and they could either be, like, say, intellectuals from universities, or sort of an old cultural elite that were very sort of hesitant to this vulgar or you know, the game of the people, right? They were a little bit too refined for that. Or, as I say, they were radical Islamists who also felt that football was something we should not really care about. We should rather read the Quran and pray and do all this Islamic stuff. You know, so the football was a waste somehow. You know. And as I also said, these are the two groups who then start criticizing football the most vocally after this Algeria games, where this bubble is starting to break apart. So that's the argument. So I think it's important to stress, and just to nuance your question a bit, that in these passages, I don't really necessarily talk about the Muslim Brotherhood. I think that I'm more interested in even more radical Islamists, if you want to put it that way, right? So Salafist or jihadist groups or something like this. This is often happening in films, that you see some guy who doesn't like football and he's very sort of Salafi beard and munaqaba woman. So because I agree with you, I don't think the Muslim Brotherhood was ever like really anti-football. They, as you say, they use football in their sort of recruitment. You know much more than me about this. Mohammed Abu Treka, the biggest player of the era, he was this sort of odd figure who never really fitted this Mubarak thing, but he was more or less explicitly a supporter of the Muslim Brotherhood, right? And it's also important to stress that this way of being a normal Egyptian guy was absolutely not secular and absolutely not Christian. He was also Muslim by default, but Muslim in a sort of benign way that was not dangerous for the regime. So I think, of course, the Brotherhood better than I do, but I think if I would think about them, I think that they took a quite pragmatic, maybe a reformist stance versus football. So they were critical to parts of this sort of biggest chauvinism and nationalism around the game, perhaps. The sort of fanaticism, ta'assub, as it's usually talked about in Egypt. And I think they were also more skeptical to the sort of televised big spectacle rather than the played game. I think what you're talking about when they use football is rather when they football as a played game, which is much less politically charged, I guess. And I also think maybe we can think about what is the chicken and what is the egg here? Do the Muslim Brotherhood use football because they like football, or did they have to get engaged with football in this era because football was this thing defining the whole nation, and if they then wanted to be part of this nation, they sort of had to use this, right? I don't really know. This is something that would require more research. But it might actually be that this argument is more strengthening my case, that football is this so important, so defining of the moment that they couldn't stand outside. Then they would be totally marginalized, right? So maybe they were just trying to play the game from the inside, maybe as they did also with politics, with the parliament and elections and everything in this area.
And there is actually another analogy that we can do when we come to think of the Muslim Brotherhood and football actors, and it's actually a methodological challenge, how to account for rise and fall without writing history backward in a teleological way. More specifically, how to empirically capture rise and fall, connected different scales of reality. If I want to maybe be more clear about that, it's like, it is possible. I mean, we can do this hypothesis that what looks as a rise, as a bubble of football, for example, on the mediatic scale of reality, on the national mediatic scale of reality, maybe does not actually reflect how the majority of the people would feel about it. And it is also possible that when the bubble deflates, bursts at the national level, it does not exactly feel the same for large sections of the population, and maybe outside of Cairo, in countryside and so on. So the decline could be superficial. So you actually face this important challenge throughout the book. Like it's very interesting to see how you really face this question and you try to find your way methodologically to answer it. So in particular, in chapter 6, you find a very convincing way of accounting for such a sudden change and how to link different scales of reality or stages. So, if the main dynamics of the delegitimation of football is the mix-up with politics, with siyasa, then you show that it actually happens on different stages that are linked together by rhythm, events, and shifts in discourses that ultimately hamper emotion and affect. So could you maybe elaborate a bit on this? And my last question here would be, how do you think that, under the regime of Sisi, do you think that the production of affects and rhythm work? This might lead us to your new research, because obviously the football bubble is not here anymore. So it might lead us actually to your new research, which also tries to comprehend and connect together different stages. And maybe it's not by chance, it's not a total coincidence that you actually work on this new research about projects in Egypt. But I will let you first answer to the first part of the question.
So just to bring it back here, so one thing that as you say here, so once again, we're coming to this thing about siasa, this unease that people feel for siasa. And one way in which I used this, which I talked about before, was to analyze this sort of rise and fall of the ultras and the politics of politics. Another interest of mine is to see how this unease for siasa made people like normal fans, lose interest in football because they felt that football and politics were getting mixed up, as you said, right? And I've tried to trace this ethnographically and try to understand, what does this mean that football and politics is mixed up? What is that really, and as you say, I break that down on different levels. So on the one hand, and I'm following one particular guy who I call Hamada, who I'm it's one of my closest interlocutors here. So one thing that happened is on the discursive level. So people especially after the Port Said massacre in 2012, 2013, and up until, well, almost today, I guess, but like especially focus on those first few years, people started to talk about football as having become political, okay? That it's in a problematic way. So, there was this feeling that, we don't want to care about football anymore because it's become so mixed up with politics. Look at how many people got killed in Port Said. Look at all this sort of, and also people have started to reevaluate the Mubarak era and feeling that, maybe we were fooled by Mubarak into this thing. And that made people sort of feeling that, maybe I shouldn't really go to games. This belongs to a different era now, we have to start anew. So on the one hand, you have this discursive mix-up, which made people feel new things or feel less for football, basically. And then secondly, there's a very concrete thing, which is that the politicians closed the stadiums, basically. So after the Port Said massacre in 1st of February 2012, first there was no games, no league at all for a year, and then afterwards the league was reintroduced, but with empty stadiums. And this went on almost for 10 years, and now it's reintroduced, but in a partial fashion. It's still not full stadiums in Egypt. So of course that killed the sort of these affective occasions, these occasions of a game and people and crowds and everything. So that's one way of which football was also killed by politics. And then thirdly, which might be the most interesting somehow, and also comes back to this idea of rhythms, is that I realized when talking to people that a lot of people felt that the everyday life during the revolutionary era had become football-like in a way, So politics was everywhere in Egypt at the time, and the way politics was playing out in the street was always feeling and looking like football. So instead of football defining the rhythms of the nation with like matches and TV shows and tournaments and everything, you had these political events, right? In Tahrir Square, demonstrations every Friday, and also these mass events, and also television focusing on that instead of football. And there was something with the sort of the effective dynamics of these events that sort of looked a little bit similar. These are unpredictable events, a lot of people coming together, flags and songs. And so there was something with a mix-up also of these sort of affective structures in society and the rhythms of something that also, a lot of people have some quotes on this obviously in the book, and which also made, there was a mix-up of these sort of affective patterns, I guess. So I guess my sum up here is that this mix-up happened on different levels. Politics and football were just like starting to look like the same. Instead of football being this secluded space, you have an everyday, and then you go into the football game, which is unpredictable and exciting. Everything looked quite exciting, but also dangerous. And football didn't really have a role to play here. And I think that's a reason why the game lost traction for a lot of people in those years. And, if you just maybe fast forward to today, I think this is to a certain degree still the case. I think the interest in club football, Ahli Zamalek, the two biggest clubs, is back in a certain way, but still not on full stadiums. But in terms of the national team, a lot of people are still talking about, like, should we really care for the national team? You know, there's this danger of getting back to these old days where football was too important. So there is something with this. And I write about that in the postscript, where it's about the World Cup in 2018 and the Africa Cup of Nations in 2019. So there is this sort of hesitancy there, and maybe that also explains why the new president, President Sisi, the current president, he is not at all as interested in this as Mubarak was. He doesn't try to instrumentalize football in the same way as Mubarak did. He never really tried that. Not even when they were hosting the Africa Cup of Nations in Egypt in 2019. Instead, and then we come into my new research, he's much more focused on mega projects and making projects, being this president who's doing things, right? So what I'm trying to do now in my new research is to look at sort of the dream of the projects in Egypt and how this has become a country which is sort of obsessed with projects. And once again, as you say, I'm trying to reconnect scales here. So I'm both looking at this sort of the politicians' mega projects, but also on sort of the way in which so many individuals have small individual business projects, and they are both called mashrua, so it's both projects and projects, and trying to say something again about masculinity and maybe not a new bubble, but a new nation that is sort of formed around projects rather than football. That's sort of so maybe there's a similarity in the way I approach these topics, even though it's not exactly the same. And then finally, in terms of rhythms, what are the rhythms of the nation today? You know, it's a difficult question. It's definitely not football. It's not there anymore in the same way. It's not as central to the thing. I say, you know, if we play with the idea that the project form or the project is sort of defining the nation, I think what is different is, of course, that it's project is ideally something that is much more focused on the future than the present. Somehow, you know, it's supposed to achieve results in a better future somehow. That this entire project state is also so much more based on media. They never, like Sisi doesn't want to have public gatherings. There's absolutely nothing of this thing of bringing people together and being part of a national crowd or anything like this. Everything is just mediatized. It's just about watching the projects in the media, or through driving on a new bridge and seeing, oh, how nice this bridge is, right? At the same time, maybe there are some rhythms to this too, as, you know, there could be this idea that, you know, there was, at least a few years ago, it was like projects opening, new projects all the time, a new bridge, a new city, a new this and this. It's almost like you had a rhythm of that in society. And maybe also something about the sort of the way in which some martyrs are commemorated. It's also a sort of rhythm. So, I don't know. I have to think more about this, but I'm sure there are some rhythms to this, the new republic, as they call it as well, even if it's definitely not related to football. Yeah.
Now, thank you so much, Carl. We really enjoyed having this talk with you. Cet épisode de Livres MAM est désormais terminé. Je vous rappelle le titre du livre de Carl Rommel, Egypt's Football Revolution, Emotion, Masculinity and Uneasy Politics. Il est paru en 2021 at University of Texas Press. Vous pouvez revoir ce webinaire sur la chaîne YouTube de l'IREMAM et le réécouter en podcast sur Anchor, Spotify, Apple Podcasts et bientôt d'autres plateformes. Merci encore, Carl Rommel, de nous avoir accordé cet entretien et merci à nos auditeurs et auditrices. Au revoir à toutes et à toutes.